The farm's mine now, Frida. You signed in front of the judge this morning. The house, the pastures, the cows, the cheese house, the land, clear down to the creek, all of it. What's yours is what you've got on your back, and that suitcase I left for you in the mudroom. Frida didn't answer right away. She stood in the middle of the farmyard with her hands folded over her apron, looking at the man she'd lived 60 years with, the way a person looks at a hailstorm coming across the field. Something terrible and already too close to outrun. Behind her, the coffee pot was still steaming on the stove. The man kept his cap on right there inside his own kitchen, because he'd never once had it corrected out of him, and he spoke with the plain confidence of a man who has already won and has only come to collect what he figures is owed him. "Fine," she said, "fine." "Everything that matters," he answered. "Sign the lawyer's paper and don't make me drive into Monroe and have people feel sorry for me. 85 years old, folks already got enough to talk about with a divorce this late in the game. 85 years old, 60 years married, one apron." Frida looked down at her own hands. They were a cheesemaker's hands, broad, the knuckles thick from decades of working curds, cured tough from all those years with her wrists down in hot whey. With those hands, she had done this every single day of her adult life in the kitchen of this house. With those hands she had kneaded and pressed and turned biscuits on the griddle, ground feed on the old stone mill that had belonged to Otto's mother, raised children, buried one of them. With those hands she had also, quietly, done one other thing her husband never knew about, but that part would keep for later. The man's name was Otto. Otto Zimmerman, 60 years back, had been a skinny farm boy who'd asked her to dance at a county fair in a neighboring town. His boots shined up and a stolen flower pinned crooked to his collar. Now he was a heavy-set old man with hard, handsome eyes, owner, according to the judge's paper, of very nearly everything there was to own. Let me get you settled into the land where this story happens, because the land is practically a character of its own here, and without understanding it, you won't understand a thing this woman did. We're in Wisconsin's Driftless area, that stretch of hill country in the southwestern corner of the state, where the glaciers way back went around instead of over, leaving steep coulees and spring-fed valleys where the rest of the Midwest got flattened out smooth. Greene County, Lafayette County, dairy country, clear to the bone, not far from the town of Monroe. Here the air smells of cut alfalfa at daybreak and warm barn straw. And every other September, the whole county turns out for Cheese Days in Monroe, the oldest cheese festival in the country, with its polka bands and its cheese-carving contests and its parade winding right down the main street. In this country, milk is close to a religion. The dairy farms of the Driftless have been sending their milk to the cheese houses of the region for more than a century, and a good milking cow is worth more than a whole field of corn. The hill pastures fill up green with clover and alfalfa in the wet months and go dry and brushy on the ridgetops. And somewhere between the two grazes, the herd that gives this whole corner of the state its name. Here on a farm with an old name, Coulee Spring, Frida Bucher Zimmerman had lived and worked since the day she married, 25 years old in a borrowed dress. It's worth telling you a little more about this county, because it isn't just any old patch of ground, and Frida was a daughter of it clear down to the bone. This part of Wisconsin was settled heavy by Swiss and German dairy families 150 years back, and it still carries their stamp, the stone farmhouses, the cheese houses, the church picnics, the surnames on the mailboxes that all end the same few ways. The hills are famous for their springs, dozens of them cold and clear, bubbling straight up out of limestone that the glaciers never scoured flat, which is exactly why the valleys keep their water when the rest of the state runs dry in August. It's also grape country, stranger than folks expect. Since the 1800s, there have been hillside vineyards over toward the river towns, rows and rows of cold, hardy vines that give grapes for the table and grapes that get pressed into wine folks have been bottling since before the Civil War. In harvest time, come September, the vineyard air turns sweet with crushed grapes, and the picker's hands go purple by noon. Frida, as a young girl, had gone out to pick grapes a few seasons before she married, and she remembered the sun on the back of her neck and the sweet, dusty taste of grapes stolen off the middle of a row, eaten quick before the foreman came round. But more than anything, its fair country Cheese Days in Monroe held every other September in the county seat. It's one of the oldest festivals of its kind in the country, more than a century of history, and people come down from all over to see it. There's a parade, there's cheese judging, there's a carnival midway, there's polka music morning till night, and a town square strung with lights where, in the old days, the girls would circle round one way and the boys the other, so everybody got a good look. It was there at a fair just like that one in a neighbouring town that a skinny farm boy asked a braided hair girl to dance 60 years back. All of this country, the springs and the vines and the fair, was Frida's whole world. She'd never known any other and never once missed one. Cooley Spring wasn't a big operation, but it was a good one. And in farm country, that counts for more than being big. It had a spring that never went dry, not even in the bad years, a rare and precious thing on hill ground where water is the first thing folks fight over. It carried about 40 milking cows, Holstein crossed with brown Swiss, gentle from years of good handling, every one of them with a name because Frida gave each of them one. It had hayfields of alfalfa and oats, a ridge pasture where the herd went up in the wet season, a corn crib, a milking parlour with a poured concrete floor that Otto had built one good year, and a thick fieldstone farmhouse with a shingled roof, cool in the heat, and warm through the cold snaps with its own stone porch and a hard-packed dirt yard, where the wash hung to dry and visitors sat of an evening. Off the back of that house, attached to it, stood the thing that truly fed that family, what folks called the summer kitchen, where Frida made the cheese. That summer kitchen is the centre of everything I'm about to tell you. It's worth looking at closely right from the start, because we're going to come back to it again and again, and it's going to turn out, by the end, that it held a great deal more than anybody ever guessed. It was a long room with a floor of old red brick pavers, the kind laid by hand and fired hard, that over the years had gone smooth and dark from decades of feet walking over them. It had a wood-fired stove built into one corner with a blackened griddle top, and a gas range in the other, because Frida never quite gave up the wood fire for certain jobs that she swore didn't come out right cooked over gas. It had a table cut from a single slab of black walnut, so heavy it took 3 men to move it. It had the big cheese vat, the cheese harps for cutting curd, the wooden hoops for pressing, the cheesecloth hanging on a line strung corner to corner, the old spring scale, the tins of salt. And it had that smell, the smell that never leaves a place where cheese has been made for 60 years. It smelled of milk, milk fresh from the cow, warm and thick with the cream still sitting on top. It smelled of rennet, that clean, sharp scent from the moment the milk starts to break and turn into something else. It smelled of pale green whey draining off. It smelled of fresh curd resting in the cloth, that mild, faintly salty, faintly sweet taste that melts on the tongue and tastes like a wet pasture at sunrise, like a contented cow. Frida could close her eyes anywhere in that kitchen and know, just by the smell, exactly how far along the curd was. 60 years had given her a kind of knowing that never comes printed on any label and no school ever taught. 60 years. The taste of that fresh cheese was known to the whole town and half the county besides. She sold it at the farmer's market in Monroe on market days, wrapped in waxed paper, and people lined up early. The big cheese processors bought it up to resell under their own label. Folks in Madison had it shipped up for weddings and christenings. Frida's cheese from Cooley Spring had a name of its own. And in farm country, having a name of your own is having the one thing nobody can take from you. That taste, that exact point of salt, that freshness no factory cheese house ever managed, was the work of her hands and nobody else's. Otto did the milking, sure, Otto tended the herd, bought the hay, kept the books, but the cheese, the thing that made the name and the reputation and most of the money, came out of her hands. Frida didn't make just one cheese. She made several, depending on the season and what folks were asking for. She made the everyday fresh curd, soft and mild, the kind that crumbles into a skillet and melts down warm. She made a firmer pressed cheese good for frying up on the griddle. She made a soft whey cheese like a farmer's cottage cheese, for baking and for spreading warm on bread. And when there was milk to spare in the flush season, when the cows were on rich new pasture and giving more than the house could use, she made an aged cheddar, salted it harder, pressed it firmer, hung it to cure in the cool pantry for weeks, turning it now and then until it went dry and sharp and biting, the kind you grate over soup or over sweet corn. Every cheese had its own timing, its own point, its own trick, and she knew every one of them by heart. The milk had its seasons too, and hardly anybody remembers that anymore. In the flush season, when the pasture greens up and the grass runs sweet, the milk comes richer and yellower, full of good grass. In the dry season, once the cows are back on hay and bought feed, the milk drops off and the flavor shifts. Frida tuned her cheese to the mood of the cows and the sky, without complaining, the way a person tunes herself to life. The flush season cheese and the dry season cheese never tasted quite the same, and the old regulars at the market noticed, and plenty of them had a preference one way or the other. Market days were her holiday. Frida would get up earlier still, load her fresh cheese wrapped in waxed paper into 2 big baskets, and ride into Monroe on the early bus. She always set her table in the same spot by the market scale, with a clean cloth laid down, and inside of an hour she had a line. They knew her by name. They'd set aside cheese for her a week ahead. They told her their troubles while she weighed their order. That table, that line, those people belonged to her. She'd earned them one regular at a time over 60 years, and they were worth every bit as much as any deed, even though no paper ever said so. She never once drew a wage for it. She was the wife. She was the house. That was how it was done, and that was what she swallowed without a word for 6 decades. And right there, in that one small detail, is where the knot of this story starts to tie, and it's worth understanding slow and careful, because this isn't only the story of an old woman stripped of everything, and there are plenty of those, and every one of them hurts. This is the story of what a woman does with silence when silence is the only thing left in her hands. Before we go on, let me ask something of you, one grown woman to another, wherever you're listening from. If there was a woman in your family who came out of a divorce, or out of being widowed with nothing, and who in spite of that stood back up with what was truly hers, what she'd earned with her own 2 hands, write her name down below in the comments. Her name, and where she was from, so it gets read, so it doesn't get lost to forgetting, because women like that are being erased and it isn't right. Leave her name down there. Hit like on this video so the message reaches more people who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single one of these stories about women nobody else bothered to tell. All right, let's keep going, because there's a long road left and the best of it is still buried, back to the farmyard. Otto standing there with his cap on, and that satisfied owner's grin. Frida looked at him a long while. Then she did something that threw him off entirely. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of anger, and it wasn't mocking either. It was a tired smile, almost tender, the kind you give a child who says something foolish with a great deal of conviction, and you don't have the heart to correct him. "All right, Otto," she said, "I'll sign whatever needs signing, just like that, just like that. What else would you have me do at my age? Wrestle you to the ground in front of the lawyer? Go door to door around town asking folks to feel sorry for me? No, Otto, not me." The man was struck speechless for a moment. He'd come ready for a fight. He had every argument loaded up inside him, every reason, every ugly thing he meant to say if she turned stubborn. And she'd taken the fight right out of his hands the way you'd take a knife from a drunk. No struggle at all, just a smile. That left him uneasy, and he couldn't have said why. A man who wins expects to meet some resistance. A man who meets none gets frightened by it. "The lawyer's coming by tomorrow," he said finally, quieter now. "Bring your identification, 10 o'clock. I'll be here." Otto turned and walked off toward the corn crib, stomping hard as if trying to convince himself he was still the one in charge. Frida stood alone in the yard, picked up the coffee pot, the one she made every single morning with her brown sugar and her cinnamon stick, and took a long, warm swallow. There it was, that sweet spiced taste with the bitter undertone of good coffee underneath. She had drunk it that same way for 60 years in that house, in that yard, watching that same bald hill turn red with the sunrise. For the first time in her life, it tasted like goodbye. Now I have to tell you how it came to this, how a woman who made the cheese that fed that family for 6 decades ended up standing in a farmyard at 85 years old, with a suitcase and an apron for her whole inheritance. It didn't happen in a day. Things like this never happen in a day. They happen drop by drop, silence by silence, until one day the glass is full and a person can't even say when it started filling. Otto and Frida married young, back in the early 1960s, back when a wedding out in dairy country was more a contract between two families than a romance between two people. Otto's father put in the cattle, a few crossbred head. Frida's father, Ferdinand Bucher, put in the land, a good stretch of Cooley Spring that had come down from his own grandfather with the spring still on it. The two pieces got joined, and the farm became what we know it as today. That matters. Hold on to it, because a great deal is going to depend on it later. The better half of the land, the half with the water, came in through her side, through her father, through her blood, and her name. They married in the county courthouse, and then again at the church proper as could be, with 3 days of dancing and enough food laid out for the whole township. In that country, in those years, marrying meant one thing for a woman: going to work sun-up to sundown in a house that was never entirely going to be hers, under a mother-in-law's rule first and a husband's always. Frida came to Cooley Spring at 25. She'd known how to make cheese since she was a girl. Her mother Matilda had taught her, and Matilda had learned it from her own mother before that. A chain of women's hands stretching back who knows how many grandmothers. There were cows at Cooley Spring, but there was no real cheese house yet. When she arrived, they were selling raw milk, which paid poorly and spoiled fast. It was Frida who set up the cheese kitchen. It was Frida who talked Otto into it, arguing late into the night more times than she could count, that it was worth more to turn the milk into something than to sell it off cheap. It was Frida who, with her own 2 hands and her own stubbornness, built the business that carried that family for 60 years. 5 children were born of that marriage, one after another. In those early years, as was the way of things then, 3 of them lived and grew up. 2 sons and a daughter, all grown now and scattered to their own lives. One in the city, one gone off to work up in a bigger town years back. The daughter married in a neighboring county. 2 didn't make it, a boy and a girl, taken small by fever, in the years when the nearest doctor was half a morning away by wagon, and medicine mostly meant prayer and hot compresses and waiting. Frida buried both of those 2 with her own hands in the little church cemetery, and every decoration day she'd carry out a jar of wildflowers and a small dish of fresh cheese and set it by their stones, because she always said that even up in heaven, children liked their mother's cheese. That loss made her hard on the inside and soft on the outside, which is the strongest mix there is in a woman. She learned early that life takes without asking and without giving back, that a person can do everything right and still lose, and that the only thing that ever stays in your hands is what you manage to set aside yourself. Her mother, Matilda, used to tell her that when she saw her crying over the children, "Save your strength, my girl, save your tears. Keep what's yours because life is long and it turns on you, and one day you'll need even what feels like extra today." Frida didn't fully understand those words until she was old, but they stayed buried down inside her, the way everything else stayed buried. Let me walk you through what it means to make cheese, slow and careful, because the whole key to everything that comes later is hidden in that craft, and because it's a trade that's dying that the machines are killing off, and it deserves to be told by somebody before there's nobody left who knows how. It all starts before daylight with the milking, when the world is still dark and cold and only the roosters are calling and some dog is barking somewhere. The milk has to come straight from the cow, still warm at the animal's own body heat, because if it cools down it won't set the same, it just isn't the same thing anymore. Frida took the strained milk into the big vat, still with the foam of the milking on top, white and alive. She smelled it, always smelled it first, bringing her nose down almost to touch it. "Bad milk you can smell before you can see it," she'd say. "A sick cow, bitter pasture, some carelessness somewhere. It's all there in the smell if you know how to smell it." Then came the rennet. Rennet is what works the miracle, what turns a liquid into a solid, what splits a living thing into 2 parts, one that stays and one that goes. In the old days it came from a dried piece of a milk calf's stomach, kept and guarded like gold and ground fine when it was needed. Frida had learned on that old natural rennet, though over the years she came to use the bottled kind, steadier and cleaner, a measure exact enough that too much would turn the cheese bitter, and too little wouldn't set it at all. She knew it by heart, by feel, no measuring cup needed. How does a mother know how much salt the broth needs? She'd stir in the rennet, work the milk slow so it spread even, And then came the hardest part of the whole trade, the part no machine has ever managed to do the same way. Waiting. Waiting in silence for the whole milk, that entire white vat of it, to set all at once and go firm as custard. 40 minutes, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on the weather, depending on the cow, depending on the mood of the day, depending on things only old hands understand and can't ever quite explain. Frida would dip her finger in, draw it out slow, watch how the cut closed back over. When the cut came clean, when the curd opened and folded back together without crumbling, it was ready. Ready. Then came the cheese harps. A cheese harp is a wooden frame strung tight with wires, like a small harp, that you use to cut the curd right there in the vat. First lengthwise, then crosswise, then on the diagonal. Patient, working it down into even little grains like wet corn kernels. That cut lets loose the whey, that pale greenish-yellow liquid that plenty of folks pour down the drain without knowing what they're throwing away, because whey still carries food in it. Frida made cottage cheese from the whey, heating it back up until the soft curds rose, and whatever was left after that went to the hogs, who grew fat and pink on nothing but the cheese scraps. On a well-run farm, nothing gets wasted. Not one drop. Frida wasted nothing. She held food in the same respect you'd hold the dead. The curd got cut, left to settle, the whey drawn off with gourds and with bare hands, and the curd in its little grains got gathered up into the cheesecloth. She'd salt it just right, press it down, pack it into the wooden hoops, and then came the pressing. Pressing is what gives the cheese its shape and its firmness, what wrings out the last of the moisture it doesn't need, stones stacked on top, or a screw press Otto had built her one good year, and hours of patience while the whey kept dripping, and at the end the cheese round, white, drained, fragrant, firm, with the exact flavor that put a line of people at her table at the market. That flavor was hers alone. Making cheese, besides all that, is a trade of cleanliness bordering on religion. One badly washed vat, one rag with a sour spot left on it, one dirty hand, and the whole batch of milk turns, sours, spoils, and you lose the work and the money of the whole morning's milking. Frida scalded her cloths, scrubbed her vat with ash and lemon, washed her arms to the elbow before she ever started. Her kitchen, brick floor and all, stayed cleaner than plenty of fine parlours in town. That care is its own kind of knowledge, too. That care is also one of the things no machine does with love, because a machine never gambles its own family's bread on every single batch the way she gambled hers every single morning. The woman who makes cheese by hand puts something into it that can't be measured or copied, and around town they just called it Frida's touch. 60 years doing that same work, every morning of every year, through hard frost and through May heat. 7 months pregnant and freshly delivered, sick with the flu and healthy, in mourning and at a celebration. 60 years getting up before the rooster while the world still slept. 60 years with her hands down in hot whey until her fingers went numb for good and could no longer stand the cold of winter. And never, not one single time in that whole life, did her name appear on a single piece of property. Not once, not on the deed to the house, not on the deed to the farm, not on the bank account where the cheese money landed. Every bit of it stood in Otto's name. Every bit of it, that was simply how it was done. I already told you that. But it's worth pausing here a moment, because this matters to a great many women listening to me right now, young and old both, and I hope you take it in. In this country, when two people marry, they marry under some kind of property arrangement, even if plenty of folks never know such a thing exists. In some states, it works close to what's called community property, where whatever gets built up during the marriage, whatever gets bought, whatever gets earned, belongs to both of them equally, half and half, even if only one name ever went on the paper. In other states, it works as separate property, where each person keeps hold of what's theirs and it never mixes together. Which one applies? It depends on the state you're in and on what got signed or never got signed. Back at the courthouse on a paper almost nobody reads. And a great many times, especially out in farm country and in the older years, the wife signed that paper without anybody ever explaining what she was signing or what it would mean for the rest of her life. She signed because her father said sign. She signed because her intended said, "Sign here, honey, don't hold things up." She signed blind with a nervous smile, thinking about the dress and the dance. Frida signed blind. She never knew, not until she was old, what arrangement she'd married under. Nobody ever showed her the papers. Nobody ever gave her a copy. Nobody ever explained a thing. They told her, sign here. And she signed at 25 in a cousin's borrowed dress. For 60 years she lived believing her father's land was still somehow hers, believing the business she'd built with her own hands belonged to both of them, believing that a whole lifetime of work would count for something the day it mattered. It didn't count. Not in the papers Otto kept locked in the dresser drawer, papers she never once laid eyes on until it was already too late. The real trouble started once Otto got old, and the greed set into him, that strange, sad greed that comes over some men at the far end of the road, as if it suddenly strikes them to gather up and clutch at what they'll never live long enough to spend. He started talking about selling the farm to one of the big dairy processors, the kind that had been buying up land all through the region, to put up industrial confinement barns, the kind with thousands of cows shut in under sheet metal roofs that never see a hillside or set a hoof on pasture in their lives. They offered more money than Otto had ever seen together in one place in his whole life. Frida fought it with everything she had. This land is my father's, Otto, she told him one night. We got married here. Our children were born here. We buried 2 of them here. I made cheese in this kitchen my whole life. This land doesn't get sold while I'm still breathing. It's mine, Frida, he answered, not even turning to look at her, his eyes on the fire. It's all in my name. I can do whatever I please with it, and I don't owe you a bit of asking. That line, it's all in my name, that line was the one that opened her eyes. Too late, too old, with the better part of her life already spent. That line taught her in a single blow what 60 years of labor never had, that in the papers that truly rule things, she didn't exist, that she could die making cheese with her hands down in the way, and her name would never once show up on the deed to that farm, that as far as the law he'd bent to his own liking was concerned, she was nothing but a shadow that milked words and set silence like curd. From that night on, the house turned into a battlefield, but not a battle of shouting, a battle of silences, which are the worst kind. Otto started moving around. He'd drive into Madison every so often with the excuse of the fair, of the doctor, of the same lawyers he always used. He started meeting with a young, hungry lawyer. He'd come home tight-lipped, his eyes sliding off to the side. Frida watched him come in and knew, with that particular knowing that comes to a woman after decades of reading a man, that he was building something against her, though she didn't yet know what. A woman who doesn't exist on paper has no way to defend herself against paper either. She's disarmed before the fight even starts. The Quiet War had its own small, everyday scenes that didn't look like anything from the outside. Otto started locking drawers that used to stand open. He started dropping his voice on the phone whenever she came near and hanging up sharp. He started carrying papers out of the dresser into town and bringing them back. And once she caught sight, without him knowing, of an envelope with the dairy processor's letterhead poking out of his satchel. He started saying, as if by accident in front of visitors, that the old woman wasn't up to working anymore, that he was carrying the farm on his own now, that it had cost him everything. Lies said out loud so often they'd turn true from the repeating. Frida heard all of it and said nothing. She kept right on making her cheese, kept right on setting his plate, kept right on drinking her coffee out in the yard, watching the hill. But inside she was more awake than she'd been in years, watchful as a barn cat, gathering up every sign, every word out of place, every paper that showed itself. She'd learned from her mother and from life that a woman who takes to shouting and demanding warns the enemy that she already knows and gives him time to hide things better. A woman who stays quiet and watches, on the other hand, lets him move around easy, confident, careless, until the day she comes down on him with everything she's been gathering. Frida's silence wasn't surrender. It was a hunt. It was around that time, in those nights of the Quiet War, that Frida started doing the thing that was going to change everything, the thing nobody ever once imagined she was doing. She started saving back. Saving back. Now listen to this close, because here is the heart of the whole story, and it isn't what most folks picture. I'm not talking about some movie treasure, some chest of gold coins glinting down in a hole, the kind of thing you get in cheap made-up stories. I'm talking about something quieter, craftier, and a good deal more powerful. I'm talking about what a smart woman does when she finally understands, after a whole lifetime, that silence can be her only weapon and decides to sharpen it. Frida started two things at once. Two things she wove together in secret over the years, thread by thread, without a single soul ever catching on. The first was gold. All through her life, out of the cheese money, Frida had been setting aside a little bit, a small part. Whatever nobody would miss, whatever didn't show up, is gone. Out of the cheese she sold on her own account at the market, out of the cottage cheese, out of the special orders for weddings and parties, out of the tips, out of the grateful regulars, she always set aside a coin, a bill, whatever she could manage without the house ever coming up short. She didn't put it in the bank, because the bank account belonged to Otto, and he went over every entry with a magnifying glass. She did what old farm wives had always done, what her mother, Matilda, had taught her in these very words. Whatever you save, my girl, turn it into gold, because gold doesn't rot, doesn't lose its value, and leaves no trail at any bank. She bought gold coins, old solid pieces, some no bigger than a dime, some heavier, the kind you buy quiet and keep, and answer to nobody about, one here, one there, over the course of almost half a century. It wasn't a rich person's fortune, it wasn't that. It was the patient, stubborn savings of a working woman, coin by coin, morning by morning, sweat by sweat, drop of whey by drop of whey across nearly 50 years of her trade. But all of it together, counted out in one single night, came to far more than Otto could ever have imagined, not even in his best accounting. It was the real price of a lifetime of work that nobody had ever once paid her for. Buying that gold without anybody catching on took every bit of patience and cunning she had. Frida couldn't go to the jeweler in town, where everybody knew her and gossip travelled faster than water downhill. She went once or twice a year into the bigger town with the excuse of the doctor, of a church errand, of fabric for a dress, and at a coin dealer's a trusted neighbour woman had pointed her toward. She'd trade her saved-up bills, worn soft from all that hiding, for a coin. Just one, or two if the year had been good. She'd wrap it in a handkerchief, tuck it against her body under her clothes, and ride the bus back looking out the window like any old woman coming home from an errand. Nobody ever once suspected. Who was going to suspect a wrinkled, quiet old dairy farmer's wife with her fingers numbed from the whey? Folks don't see old women. They pass through the world the way air does, without anybody ever noticing them. And that very forgetting, the kind that hurts so much, Frida turned into her best hiding place because it was exactly her being invisible that let her gather, coin by coin, year after year, the freedom she'd one day pull up from under the floor. Nobody guards what nobody looks at. Nobody keeps watch on the one they've already written off as finished. The second thing she kept back mattered even more than the gold, a great deal more. It was the papers. The papers. Frida hadn't read well as a girl. She'd learned as a grown woman, already married, out of sheer stubbornness, sounding out the church bulletin and the receipts by candlelight while Otto slept. But precisely because of that, she understood the value of a piece of paper better than most people ever do, because a paper had always been the very weapon that erased her, the other side's weapon. And through those years of the Quiet War, while Otto believed the old woman had no idea what was going on, that she lived in her own little world of cheese and church, Frida was gathering, one by one, with the patience of an ant, every paper that came within her reach. She saved receipts from years and years of milk and cheese sales that proved what the farm truly brought in, far above what Otto was declaring when it counted. She saved copies of the old land deeds she'd slipped out of the dresser one early morning and carried into town to photocopy, hidden inside her grocery errands, deeds that proved in black and white that the good half of the land, the half with the spring, had come into the marriage through her father, through her side. She saved a copy of the true appraisal of the farm, which she got by a bit of cunning the day the appraiser came out from the dairy processor to measure and value the place. She fed him coffee with brown sugar and warm biscuits off the griddle, treated him like one of her own, got him talking more than he meant to, and out of that conversation pulled the real number, the one the land was actually worth. Most of all, she saved proof of what Otto was hiding, that he'd already taken an advance from the company, a good-sized one, cash under the table, 8 months back. Money he meant to keep hidden from her, and from the judge in the divorce settlement so she wouldn't see a dime of it. All of it she gathered into an old tin, one of those decorated cookie tins with a faded picture on the lid, worn pale with age. All of it, the gold and the papers, the cookie tin and the coins wrapped in cloth. Frida buried. She buried it where nobody would ever think to look, where only she ever set foot, where Otto hadn't laid a hand in 60 years, because cheese-making and sweeping and scrubbing that kitchen floor were, to his mind, women's business beneath him, the sort of thing a man didn't lower himself to even glance at, under the kitchen floor, under the old red brick pavers, where she'd made cheese her whole life. One shut-tight night, alone, with Otto snoring on the far side of the house and the dogs quiet, Frida pried up 3 bricks next to the stove, right in the corner where she always set the curd vat, where the floor stayed a little damp from spilled whey, and nobody ever paid it any mind. She dug with an old pewter spoon and with her bare hands. She dug slow without a sound, stopping every so often to listen for Otto's snoring to keep going steady. Breathing in that smell rising up out of the turned earth, a smell of wet clay and root and earthworm and the very bottom of the world, mixed together with the smell of milk and whey that had soaked into that floor since forever. That smell of open earth under the kitchen stayed with her the rest of her life, and years later, plenty of times, she'd smell it again in her dreams. She put the tin, wrapped in plastic, down into the hole, put the gold in its cloth wrappings in beside it, set the 3 bricks back one by one, pressing each down with the flat of her palm. She stood on them, swept up, sprinkled a little ash from the stove over the spot to even out the color. Not a soul ever noticed a thing. That night, once her secret was buried, Frida didn't go straight to bed. She sat a while on the little stool in the kitchen, in the dark, listening to her own breathing. She didn't know yet whether she'd ever need what she'd just hidden away. She half prayed she wouldn't, that things would work themselves out, that Otto would come to his senses, and all of it would just stay under that ground, forgotten forever. What she was burying down there at bottom wasn't a treasure, it was a fear. The old fear of a woman who knows she could be left with nothing overnight, who has watched her own mother end up with nothing, her aunts, the widows of the town. She wrapped that fear in cloth right alongside the gold and put it under the floor so she wouldn't have to carry it around awake. She washed her hands on her apron. They still smelled of turned earth, of wet clay from down deep, and that smell mixed into her palms with the smell that was always there. Milk and cheese, earth and milk, what's hidden below and what's ordinary every day. That's how her kitchen stayed from that night on, with both things together under the same floor. And so it went for years, with nobody but her ever knowing that the corner where she set the vat held a great deal more than whey dampness. For years she cooked over her own buried secret, made cheese over her buried independence, flipped biscuits on the griddle 2 steps from the proof that would one day change everything. She knelt to scrub that floor 1,000 times without her hand ever shaking, and she kept quiet. She kept quiet the way only women who've learned the hard way keep quiet, that talking too soon loses everything, that a loose tongue buries more people than the ground ever does. Carrying a secret that many years wears on a person, wears from the inside. There were mornings when Frida, scrubbing that corner of the floor, felt the pull to tell somebody, a neighbor woman, her daughter, a pastor at confession, if only for the relief of setting the weight down. She never did. She never once gave in. She knew a secret shared stops being a secret, that it only takes one loose word for the whole thing to come down. She carried it alone with the knowledge of what lay underneath, and that loneliness was the price of her freedom to come. She paid it in full, no haggling in the coin of silence, keeping quiet. The divorce came the way hail comes in the driftless hills, all of a sudden, on a clear afternoon, ruining everything. Otto served her with the papers without a word of warning. He made ugly claims to justify himself to the town and to the judge, said they didn't get along anymore, said she'd gone old and stubborn and bitter, said he wanted to live his last years in peace, free of complaints. The truth was something else, and the whole town suspected it. He wanted to sell the farm, pocket every last dollar of it, and leave her without enough for bus fare. That was what the divorce was for. That and making sure the property split left him with everything and her with nothing. The town talked. Of course it talked. A divorce between 2 old people after 60 years was rich material for wagging tongues. Some said Frida must have done something, that there had to be a reason that quiet women were always the worst. Most, the bigger share, pitied her under their breath and did nothing about it, which is what people mostly do. Pity without lifting a hand. The women at the market brought her their sympathy, the way folks bring flowers to a wake, long faces, asking her things they already knew just to hear her tell it. Frida never gave them the satisfaction. She kept coming to market with her cheese standing straight, her good coat on, greeting everybody by name as if she hadn't heard a word of what they were saying. A town's tongue tires itself out if you don't feed it. Inside it was something else entirely. Inside there was humiliation, that deep humiliation of the woman who gave everything and gets put out like an old hired hand who's no more use. There were nights the tears got the better of her alone, face down in the pillow so nobody would hear. But come morning she'd get up, wash her face in cold water, pin up her hair, and go make cheese, because work saves a person, because busy hands don't shake, because as long as she was cutting curd she was still herself, and not what Otto was telling people she was. Work was her wall and her medicine through those ugly months. With the papers on his side, with the deed in his name, with the property arrangement she'd signed blind 60 years back, Otto very nearly pulled it off. The judge, looking only at the papers Otto put in front of him, the clean deed, the low, dishonest appraisal Otto brought along, ruled the way you'd expect. The whole farm to him, a suitcase and a charity settlement for her, very nearly. There was one thing Otto's papers didn't say, one thing no judge in the world could have seen from behind a desk, one thing buried under 3 brick pavers in a kitchen he considered his and had never once truly looked at. The night before she was to sign the settlement, Frida didn't sleep a wink. She sat in the little room they'd left her, the one with the odds and ends, her suitcase in the corner, listening to the sounds of a house that wasn't hers anymore. Otto snored steady in the back, easy, sure of his win, sleeping the sleep of a man who believes he's already won. Outside, the dogs barked in fits and starts, and far off across the flat, a freight train crossed the night toward the city with its long, sad whistle. Frida stared up at the dark beams of the ceiling, her hands crossed over her chest like someone laid out for a wake. She thought of her mother, of Matilda, of her thin hands showing her how to cut curd. "Keep what's yours, my girl." She thought of her father, of Ferdinand, handing the land over to Otto on their wedding day, happy, proud, not knowing what he was doing, not knowing he was signing off on his daughter's slow ruin. She thought of the 2 children buried in the little church cemetery, a boy and a girl taken small by fever, back when the doctor was hours away by road. She thought of 60 years of daybreaks, one after another, all alike, all hers. She remembered, without meaning to, her wedding day, how she'd trembled in the church in a borrowed dress, how Ferdinand, her father, had squeezed her arm and told her quietly that Otto was a good boy, hard-working, that he'd take care of her. She remembered the first time she made cheese in that kitchen, with her mother-in-law watching over her shoulder, criticizing everything, and how little by little she'd earned her place through pure work until that kitchen was hers and hers alone. She remembered the birthdays, the Christmases with the house full, the christenings, the smell of a roast in the yard. 60 years fit into one sleepless night, packed tight, and Frida felt every bit of it, the good and the bad, parading past her closed eyes like a county fair. She didn't feel bitterness, and that was the strange part. She felt something deeper and sadder than bitterness. She felt that she'd been used without ever being truly seen, that she had loved for real, given for real, and that from the other side there had never been the same measure returned. That discovery at 85 hurt worse than any loss of land. They'd taken the farm from her, yes, but before that, long before, without her ever noticing, they'd taken away the belief that she'd been loved the way she'd loved. No paper could ever divide that back up. She kept thinking about the tin. At some point deep in that long night, when the pendulum clock in the front room struck 3 in the dark, Frida got up, her joints creaking, pulled her shawl on over her nightgown, took a stub of candle and a spoon from the little kitchenette in the room, and stepped out into the dark hallway, barefoot so as not to make a sound on the cold floor, her heart pounding in her chest the way it hadn't pounded since she was a girl, since the day Otto first asked her to dance. She walked through the sleeping house close to the wall. She passed Otto's door where the snoring rolled on steady and deep. She passed the dining room, dodging the corner of the table from memory. She reached the kitchen door, her kitchen, the kitchen where she'd made cheese for 60 years and where now, according to the judge's paper, she no longer had any right even to enter. She stopped a moment in front of that door in the dark hallway, the candle still unlit in her hand so as not to wake anyone. She thought of all the times she'd crossed that threshold in 60 years, before dawn, half asleep, to set the milk. At night, worn out, to leave things soaking. In daylight, a child on her hip, and another tugging at her skirt, pregnant in mourning, happy. That door she'd crossed more times than any other door in the world. And now, by law, she had no right even to push it open. The whole house slept around her, indifferent. The house she had made a home and that a piece of paper had turned into somebody else's property. It seemed to her in the dark that the house itself watched her pass the way you'd watch a stranger go by. She pushed the door open. It creaked softly, the same as always, a creak she knew by heart. She went in. Everything sat there just as always, asleep in the dark. The black walnut table, the cold stove with its griddle top, the curd vat turned upside down, the cheesecloth hanging still on the line like thin ghosts, and the smell, that smell of milk and whey and a whole lifetime of cheese, mixed now in the night with the cold smell of old ash from the stove. Frida breathed deep, filling her chest with that air that felt almost like her own blood. Her mouth watered, without having eaten a thing, for the fresh cheese of other mornings, salty and sweet and mild, and for the coffee that would never boil in that pot again. She struck a match and lit the candle. The yellow light shook and stretched across the red brick floor. She walked to the corner by the stove. She knelt with great effort, her old joints protesting, and laid the flat of her hand on the 3 bricks she herself had pried loose years back, on another night just as dark. She knew them one by one, the way she knew every note of her own life. She knew which one moved first, which one stuck, which one had to come out sideways. She worked the tip of the spoon into the seam of the first one. There she stopped, with the spoon wedged in the crack, the candle trembling, 85 years and 60 years of marriage bearing down whole on her bent back. Frida went still for a moment that felt endless, because she knew that the second she lifted that brick, there'd be no turning back, that what had lain buried and silent all those years was finally about to come up into the light, and that with it, something else was starting. Something even she didn't fully know how it would end. Before she lifts it, I need to ask you for something quick, because what's coming next you cannot afford to miss. If you want to know exactly what Frida had buried under that kitchen, and what happened the next morning when she laid it out on the table in front of Otto, subscribe to the channel right now, hit that button, because this is only just getting started, and the best part comes next. Leave me a comment below telling me where you're listening from. What farm, what county, what town, what city, so I can say hello. And give this video a like so it reaches another woman who needs to hear today that it's never too late to get back what's hers. All right, now let's lift that brick. She lifted it. It came up with a dry, cracking sound, clay breaking free of clay, the same sound she remembered from that other night. Underneath, the earth showed darker, more packed, with that old dampness the corner by the way never fully lost. Frida lifted the second brick, then the third, setting them carefully to the side. The smell rose up into her face again, the same as always, that smell of turned earth under the kitchen that had stayed etched in her ever since the night she buried it all, wet clay and root, and the very bottom of the world, mixed with the smell of set milk that had soaked into that floor for 6 decades. She reached her hand into the cold hollow. Everything was there. The old tin, its lid faded, wrapped in the plastic she'd put over it to keep out the worst of the damp. And beside the tin, the cloth bundles, heavy, heavier than her old hand remembered, so heavy she had to lift them out one at a time. She set them down on the red brick floor one by one, in the shaking candlelight, like a woman drawing living things up out of the earth. She unwrapped the first bundle with clumsy fingers. The gold appeared. The coins, pure gold pieces, gathered one by one over nearly half a century, gleamed yellow and clean in the candlelight, as bright as the day they were struck, because gold doesn't age. Gold waits quiet and unchanged, while everything else spends itself and wrinkles and dies. Frida counted them slow, her fingers trembling, laying them out in little rows on the floor. They were all there, not one missing. The whole savings of a lifetime of daybreaks, of hot whey, of numbed fingers, of cheese sold wrapped in waxed paper at 5 in the afternoon at the market, sat whole and safe in her hands, complete. Then she opened the tin. Inside were the papers, dry, whole, yellowed but readable, protected by the plastic and the tin lid. Years and years of milk and cheese receipts bundled with a string, the copies of the old deeds that proved where the good land had come from, the true appraisal she'd coaxed out of the company man with coffee and biscuits, and the most important paper of all, the one worth the whole farm. Right alongside the copy of the receipt for the advance payment, Otto had already collected from the dairy processor. The money under the table he meant to hide from the judge and from her forever. Frida stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor of her kitchen, the gold gleaming on one side and the papers on the other, and for the first time in a very long while, in that dark kitchen past 3 in the morning, she stopped feeling alone. She wasn't alone. Everything she herself had had the good sense to save kept her company. Her own patient cunning kept her company. The young woman she'd once been kept her company. The one who'd had the instinct not to trust entirely, to set things aside, to keep quiet, to bury. Across the years she was reaching back and taking the hand of the girl she used to be. She wrapped it all up again with care, the gold in its cloth, the papers back in the tin. She set the 3 bricks back in place, pressing them down, standing on them, and swept up the little bit of loose dirt with the kitchen broom and scattered ash over it to even out the color. Nobody would notice a thing. Once more she carried the bundles and the tin to the little back room, hidden under her shawl, pressed to her chest and packed them into the bottom of her suitcase, that same suitcase Otto had left for her in the mudroom with such contempt, believing it held nothing but an old woman's rags. In that suitcase he'd written off as nothing rode the whole farm now, rode her whole life. Morning came the way it always does, not caring for anybody. The day of the signing came clear and cold, with that clean golden light the driftless hills get on a winter morning, when the ridgeline stands out against the sky like something painted. Otto's lawyer arrived right on time at 10, a young man in a grey suit with a leather briefcase, in that impatient hurry of somebody who bills by the hour and has another appointment lined up. They sat around the dining table. Otto had his cap on again, right there in the house, and a satisfied proprietary grin. On the table, laid out neat, sat the divorce papers, ready, waiting only on Frida's trembling signature to close it all out. "Good morning, ma'am," the lawyer said, barely looking at her. "This won't take long, I won't keep you. You just sign here where the X is marked, and here at the bottom, and that's that. That formalizes the agreement. The property and all assets go to Mr. Zimmerman, and you receive a settlement payment in exchange as laid out in Clause 4. "How much is the settlement, Counselor?" Frida asked, calm as could be, straightening her shawl. The lawyer named a figure, a pittance enough for a few months in a rented room, barely enough to keep from starving right off. Otto, hearing the amount said out loud, grinned wider still. Frida nodded slow, as if she were truly weighing it, as if she were unsure. Then she said in that same soft, mild voice, the voice Otto had spent 60 years hearing without ever once listening to, "Counselor, before I sign, let me show you a few little things, just so everything's good and clear and there's no misunderstanding later between the family, no fighting among the children left behind." "Ma'am, honestly, that isn't necessary. The agreement is already settled and the judge is waiting on it," he said. "You just take a look a moment, let me pour you some coffee while you do," she said, and used, with no apparent malice at all, the very same words he'd used on her. She got up slow, went to the little room, came back with the suitcase, that same worn old suitcase, and set it on the dining table, right in the middle, between the divorce papers and the coffee cups. Otto looked at it with irritation, his eyebrows drawn together. Sure, the old woman was about to put on one of her scenes, pull out some sob story, cry and beg in front of the lawyer. Frida opened the suitcase. She took out the papers first, leaving the gold inside, quiet for later. "This," she said, setting the first bundle, tied with string, on the table beside the lawyer's coffee cup, "is the receipts from milk and cheese sales for the last 20 years. They're sorted by year. You can see right here in plain numbers what this farm truly brings in every month and every year. Compare them, Counselor, take your time, against what my husband declared to the court about his earnings." You'll see it doesn't match. Doesn't match by a long shot, there's zeros missing. The lawyer, out of pure professional habit, picked up the bundle and started leafing through it. His face, which had walked in smiling, began to change. It went serious. He leaned in over the papers. This, Frida went on, setting down the second bundle, is copies of the old land deeds, the original ones. Right here, sealed and dated. It's on record that half of this land, the good half, the half with the spring, came into this marriage in my father's name, Ferdinand Bucher. Rest his soul. It came in through me, through my blood, not through him, through me. Otto shot to his feet, knocking his chair back. Frida, what in the hell is this? Where did you get this? Sit down, Otto, she said, without raising her voice one bit, without even turning to look at him. I'm not finished yet. Pick your chair back up and sit down. You're setting a poor example in front of the lawyer. Otto, who had run that house for 60 years, sat down. He couldn't have said why he did it. Frida set the third paper on the table. This is the real appraisal of the farm. The true one, Counselor, not the one my husband handed the court. The company's own appraiser gave it to me, the man who came out last year to measure and value the place. The same man who sat in my kitchen, eating warm biscuits off the griddle and drinking my coffee. This farm is worth 4 times what Otto declared. 4 times, Counselor, read it yourself, the number's right there. The lawyer swallowed hard, set the receipts down on the table. His stomach was going cold as he began to understand that this had slipped clean out of his hands, that he'd come to close out an easy piece of paperwork and had walked into something else entirely. Then, Frida set the last paper on the table. She laid it down slow with just 2 fingers, pushing it toward the center the way you'd lay down the card that wins the whole hand at once. And this, she said, her voice still soft, is the copy of the receipt for the advance payment they already gave you, Otto. The money you already pocketed off the dairy processor under the table 8 months ago and never declared in the divorce. Right here, dated, the amount, your own signature at the bottom. Hiding assets in a divorce proceeding. That, Counselor, far as I understand it with my own plain ignorance, an old woman who barely learned to read, has another name under the law, and I'd guess it isn't a pretty one. Silence. A thick, heavy silence, the kind you could have cut with a cheese harp. Otto, on his feet again without quite realizing it, had gone pale as ash off the stove. The lawyer had stopped smiling altogether and was looking at the papers the way you'd look at a snake in the road. Frida, seated with her hands folded on the table, just the way she used to fold them over her apron, was the only calm person left in that whole dining room. These documents, the lawyer said finally, in a very different voice now, the voice of a man already running new numbers fast in his head, change things considerably, Mr. Zimmerman, considerably. If this is what it looks like, and it looks that way, the agreement we drew up doesn't hold. Hiding assets in the proceeding, undervaluing the property by 3/4, failing to declare an advance already collected, the other party, meaning your wife, can petition tomorrow to void this agreement entirely and get a full review of the property split. And as for that undeclared advance, if this reaches the judge the way it ought to, with the copy signed. Shut your mouth, Otto told him, hoarse. No, Counselor, don't you shut your mouth, Frida said, soft as ever. Go right on. You're explaining it very well, better than I could say it myself. Drink your coffee before it goes cold. Let me pause here with you a moment again, because what Frida had just done on that dining room table is a lesson in life and in law that a great many women ought to know, and almost none of them do. That's why I'm telling it slow, with her own words and her own reasons. In a divorce, when there's property on the line, the law isn't as blind or as deaf as it looks from a distance. It's true the paperwork carries a great deal of weight, that whoever holds the deed in their name starts out ahead, that a woman who signed blind 60 years back begins the fight already behind and climbing uphill. All of that is true, and it's unfair, and that's simply how it is. But there's another truth just as strong that people forget. Hiding assets in a proceeding, lying under oath about the value of what's being divided, concealing money already received, all of that is fraud on the court. And fraud, once it's proven with paper in hand, brings the whole agreement down, voids it, breaks it apart the way separates from curd. A judge who learns that one side lied to his face and hid assets gets truly angry. And when a judge gets angry, the cheat's paper advantage flips over in a single stroke. the way you flip a biscuit on the griddle once it's browned on one side. Frida never had the farm deed in her name, never once, but she held in her hand the proof that Otto had lied and hidden things, and that in the hands of a lawyer who knew how to use it was worth as much as any deed, maybe more, because it didn't just defend her, it sank him, keeping the proof, holding on to the proof, documenting even when nobody's watching, even when it seems to serve no purpose at all, even if you have to bury it under the floor of your own kitchen for years and cook right over it. That's what saved Frida. Not luck, not a miracle, not some treasure dropped from the sky. She was saved by her own patient, humble habit of setting things aside, of writing things down, of never trusting entirely, of turning silence into a sharpened weapon instead of a quiet defeat. Listen close to me, woman, wherever you're hearing this from. If anything can save a woman the day the floor opens up under her feet, it's what she herself had the care and the humility to set aside while there was still time, while nobody was watching, while it seemed like there was no need for it at all. There's something else worth knowing in case it's ever your turn, or a daughter's or a neighbor's, because the law has kept changing, and today it protects a woman a good deal more than it protected Frida in her time. In a lot of states these days, when a wife gave her whole life to the house and to the family's work, without ever drawing a wage, without that work ever showing up on a single piece of paper, the law now recognizes that the work counts, that it carries a value, and that it earns her some compensation for it when a divorce comes. It goes by different names depending on the state: spousal maintenance, equitable distribution, but the heart of it is the same. The one who stayed home working for free doesn't walk away empty-handed, just because the paperwork sits in the other person's name. That work built what's there too. It just paid for it in years instead of dollars. In Frida's time, hardly any of that applied, or nobody knew about it, or there was nobody around to explain it to a dairy farmer's wife. That's why she had to defend herself alone, the old way, with her gold and her proof. But you, listening to me today, learn this and keep it. The work of running a house isn't free, even when nobody pays you for it at the time. Document what you put in. Keep your receipts, your records, the proof of what the two of you build together. Don't do it out of distrust or bad faith. Do it the same reason you carry insurance, not because you want the house to burn down, but because it can burn down. A woman who documents isn't betraying anybody. She's looking after herself, which is both her right and her responsibility. Back to the dining room, to the table, to the coffee going cold. Otto was undone, not out of shame. He'd never had much of that in him, but out of fear. A cold fear climbing up out of his stomach. He was finally seeing the true size of the hole he'd dug for himself, all on his own. If Frida took those papers to the judge, he wouldn't just lose his edge in the property split and owe her a fair half. He could face charges over the hidden money, a proceeding, who knew what else. He could lose a great deal, far more than half. He could lose everything. And on top of it, the public shame of a fraud case at his age, in his 80s. Otto still tried to defend himself. Men like him try to defend themselves right up to their last breath, even flat on their back already. "Frida, you don't understand these things," he said, his voice shaking. "I did all of it for the family. That advance was to settle some business, to leave you with everything and me with nothing." She cut him off without raising her voice. "Don't explain yourself to me, Otto. I've known you 60 years. I can read you better than I can read these papers, and it cost me plenty to learn to read at all. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to offer you a way out that's a good deal more than what you offered me." The lawyer looked from one to the other, quiet, understanding that right there at that table, between those two old people, something far deeper than a property split was being decided. 60 years were on the line. Who each of them had truly been to the other all that time was on the line. "What do you want, Frida?" Otto said at last, sinking back into his chair, suddenly old all at once, as if 10 more years had landed on him in a single minute. "Tell me straight out. What is it you want?" Frida looked at him a long while. "And listen close here, because this is where the story turns into something else, where it stops being a tale of revenge and becomes a story about dignity instead, which is a far bigger, far rarer thing." "I don't want everything, Otto," she said slowly. "I never wanted everything. Even with the power to ruin you today, I don't want to ruin you. I'm 85 years old and I'm not about to spend what little time I've got left in a years-long fight just to leave you out on the street with nothing. I'll leave that to you, seeing as you were capable of doing it to me. I'm not you, Otto. I never was you, and I'm proud to say it." She paused, took a small swallow of her coffee, the sweet, cinnamon kind that tasted like her whole life. "I want what's mine," she said, "only what's mine. I want half the land that came in through my father, the half with the spring. I want half of what this farm is truly worth, not the lie you declared. I want the cheese house, the kitchen, the cheese, everything I built with these hands over 60 years to count for something, to carry a value, to show up on paper. And I want it written down, but written down properly this time, clear and plain, with my full name on it. Not blind the way I signed the last time. With that, I'll go in peace. The rest, keep it. The house, whatever cattle you want, your whole share. I didn't come to rob you, Otto. I only came so you couldn't rob me." The lawyer, already working by instinct for whichever side held the truth and the paperwork, nodded several times. "That's a very reasonable proposal, ma'am, honestly. Very measured, a good deal less than what a judge would award you with these documents in hand. Mr. Zimmerman, with respect, in your position, I'd take it right now, before the lady thinks better of it, or consults a more aggressive attorney." Otto sat without a word for a long while. He looked at the papers scattered across the table. He looked at the open suitcase, where he hadn't even noticed the gold sleeping inside. He looked at the calm, weathered face of the woman he'd lived with for 60 years and had never once, in all that time, bothered to truly look at. And in that face, that winter morning, for the first time in his life, he saw somebody. Not the old woman in the apron, not the cheesemaker who put food on his table. He saw a whole person with a patient, deep intelligence who had stood right there beside him, quiet, every single day of all those years, and whom he had scorned and walked over right up to the last minute. "All right," he said finally, his voice breaking, looking at the table. "All right, Frida, let it be the way you say, let it be." Frida nodded once, slow, and started gathering her papers off the table, tidy, unhurried, the way you'd clear dishes after a meal. There was no shout of triumph, no tears, not one word too many. She packed it all back into the suitcase on top of the gold Otto had never once seen, closed the latch, and sat there, calm, waiting for the lawyer to write up the terms. 60 years of marriage ended like that, at a dining table, with coffee going cold in 3 cups, and an old woman gathering up her evidence in silence. Sometimes justice doesn't make a sound. Sometimes it's just a woman who kept what was hers and showed up right on time the day it mattered. The agreement got redrawn. It took weeks because the law moves slow and crooked, and it took bringing in a lawyer on her side too, a real one, a good one from the city, whom Frida paid with 2 of her gold coins without her hand shaking once as she handed them over. The appraisal got redone, the true one this time, with a new appraiser. It went on record in black and white and sealed that half the land, the half with the spring, had come in through Frida's side, through her father. She was awarded her fair share, half the true value of the farm in hard cash, plus a portion of the land she chose herself, the half with the spring, the piece nearest the old house, and it went on record that if Otto still wanted to go through with selling to the dairy processor, it would now have to happen with her agreement and her signature right alongside his, never again behind her back. The lawyer she brought in, the good one from the city, was named Attorney Roy Anderson, a serious man with glasses who at first looked at her with that condescension city-educated folks sometimes have for farm people. That condescension didn't last long. When Frida laid her receipts out in front of him, sorted by year, her copies of the deeds, her appraisal, her receipt for the advance, Attorney Anderson took off his glasses, wiped them slow with a handkerchief, and told her, "Ma'am, with all respect, you put all of this together yourself with nobody telling you how. Alone, counselor. Who was there to tell me? I'll be honest with you. I've seen divorces of educated people, wealthy people, with lawyers from the start, who walk into court worse armed than you. This is complete. This wins." And it did win, though not in a courtroom fight, but at a table negotiating, which is nearly always better. With Frida's proof laid out on the table, Otto had no way to fight it without risking losing everything and coming out publicly branded a cheat. He signed what needed signing. Attorney Anderson made sure that this time every word came out clear. every figure in writing, every asset accounted for, and that Frida understood and approved every line before she put her name to it. She was never going to sign blind again. She'd sworn that to herself, and she kept the promise. Frida didn't walk away with everything. She walked away with what was hers. There is a difference the size of the whole sky between those two things, a difference it took Frida 60 years of daybreaks to fully understand, and I hope it costs you less. The day her share was formally handed over, Frida went to the bank in Monroe, alone, in her good shawl coat carrying her suitcase walking tall, and opened for the first time in her whole 85 years an account in her own name. The young woman at the bank asked for her name for the paperwork, and Frida said it slow, savoring every syllable the way a person savors putting on a new dress after a whole life of hand-me-downs. Frida Bucher, she said. Not Zimmerman. Bucher, her father's name. The name of the land, the name of the spring, the name of Matilda's thin hands that had taught her to cut curd. The young woman typed it in, and Frida watched it appear on the screen and on the paper. Her name, hers alone, hers and nobody else's. And she felt something in her chest she hadn't felt since she was a girl. She walked out of the bank with her new passbook held tight to her chest under her shawl, the same way she'd carried her gold coins for so many years. She sat a while on a bench in the square in the sun, looking at the passbook. There was her name, printed, official, recognized for the first time in 85 years. Frida Bucher. It seemed to her a strange thing, that such a small thing, one line in a passbook, could weigh so much. Her whole life she had existed for the work, for the children, for the husband, for the house, and yet, on paper, she had never once existed. Now she did. Now, even if it was at the far end of the road, the world had it in writing that she was somebody, with a name and with what was hers. To celebrate, she bought herself a Bismarck from the bakery on the corner, one of the pink frosted ones, and ate it there on the bench, slow, dunking it in nothing, just for the pleasure of it. It had been years since she'd let herself have a treat that silly, that entirely her own. She remembered her mother buying her one when she was small, on trips down to the fair, and it brought back the taste of those days, when everything was still ahead of her and she didn't yet know what life had waiting for her. Good flavor, sweet without guilt, the taste of starting over even this late. With her share of the money and with her gold, Frida bought a small white house at the edge of town, whitewashed, with a little lot out back big enough for 3 cows and a fig tree. She'd have to winter indoors. She bought gentle Holsteins and named every one of them, and she set up again at 85 with her old, numbed hands that could barely stand the cold anymore, a tiny cheese kitchen all her own. The new kitchen didn't carry 60 years of smell in its walls yet. It smelled of fresh whitewash and paint. But Frida knew with the wisdom of the trade that the smell comes on its own, that all it takes is making cheese every single day and waiting patient, the same way you wait for milk to set without rushing it. She made cheese again. The first curd she cut in that new kitchen made her cry, but a different kind of crying. It wasn't grief. She took the milk from her 3 cows into a small vat, smelled it as always, stirred in her rennet and waited, kneeling in front of the vat like a woman before an altar for the milk to set. When she dipped her finger in and the cut came clean, clean the way it should, Frida felt something inside her setting too, taking shape, going firm again after so long adrift and unraveled. She cut the curd with her old cheese harp, drew off the whey, and out came the first cheese, round, white, drained, fragrant, and she set it on the new table and looked at it a long while. It's a plain little thing, some might say, a cheese like any other. To her it was a flag. It was the proof that they'd knocked her down and hadn't finished her. She tasted a bit of it standing there, alone in her kitchen. That flavor, salty and sweet and fresh, the very same one, hers, the one that not the divorce, not the loss, not 85 years, had managed to take out of her hands. It tasted like a pasture at daybreak, tasted like her mother, tasted like who she was when nobody was giving her orders. And into the new air of that kitchen, mixed faint with the smell of fresh whitewash, there began to settle, still shy, the smell of set milk that in time would turn that place into home again. She went back to the market on market days, to her old spot, with her fresh cheese wrapped in waxed paper, and people started lining up early again, because that flavor doesn't come store-bought and it doesn't get handed down free. It's either in your hands or it isn't, and it was in hers. That first market day back, the old regulars welcomed her the way you welcome someone you thought you'd lost. Plenty of them had written her off once the divorce made the rounds of the gossip. Many figured they'd never see her again, that she'd die of grief in some rented room somewhere the way so many do. Watching her come back with her 2 baskets, setting her clean cloth down by the scale, arranging her cheese wrapped in waxed paper, felt to them almost like a small miracle, the kind that makes a person want to clap. One after another they came up to buy from her, not just for the cheese but to shake her hand, to tell her, "So good to see you, Frida, so good to have you back." She sold out before noon that day. That day she knew she had truly come back, that they hadn't finished her, that her place in the world was still there waiting, kept safe by the people who loved her. The taste of Frida's cheese, salty and sweet and fresh as a dewy pasture morning, was back on the tongues and on the tables of that town. And in her new kitchen, the coffee pot boiled again with its brown sugar and its cinnamon stick, and the biscuits puffed up again on the old blackened griddle she'd hauled over from the farm. The one thing she took with her from that place, and there was life and smell and smoke again where just a few months before there had only been a suitcase and an apron. Not everything came back, though. And I'd be lying to you and disrespecting you both if I told this story as if it ended in nothing but celebration and church bells, because it doesn't end that way. Almost no true story ever does. The farm she'd given her whole life to, Cooley Spring, went to Otto with his share. And in the end, old and alone, he sold it off to the dairy processor, just as he'd wanted all along. Frida signed her part of the sale, collected what was fair, what was hers, and that was as far as her dealings with that land ever went again. But the thick stone farmhouse where she'd raised her children, where she'd buried 2 of them, where she'd made cheese for 60 years, they tore it down. A yellow machine came through one morning and took it apart in a matter of hours, stone by stone, beam by beam. In its place they put up an industrial confinement barn of sheet metal and steel piping, with thousands of cows shut in under a roof, cows that would never see a hillside or set a hoof on pasture or be known by name. The kitchen with the red brick floor, the kitchen where her independence had lain buried all those years, where the smell of milk and whey had lived in the walls for 6 decades, doesn't exist anymore. It was wiped off the earth in one morning of machines. Frida went out to see the new facility from the road exactly once, riding the bus into town on an errand. She didn't get off. She sat looking out the window a long while, the sheet metal flashing in the sun where her house, her yard, her kitchen, her whole life used to stand. Then she told the young man driving, "Let's go on, son, I've seen enough." She didn't cry there on the bus in front of everybody. She cried later that night, in her new kitchen that was already starting to smell of cheese, alone with her coffee going cold in the cup. She cried for the house, cried for the years. She cried for the 2 children buried there, left now with nobody to visit them, under somebody else's pasture, under the noise of the machines. She cried for 60 years that weren't coming back, for the girl in the borrowed dress who signed blind not knowing, for everything that's lost forever, even when a person comes out ahead in the end, because winning isn't the same as never having lost. Frida won her share, won her name, won her independence and her new kitchen, but she lost her home, lost her marriage, lost the one place in the world where she had been young and a mother and a wife. And no paper, no judge, no gold coin, however brightly it shone, ever gave that back to her. Some things never come back. Word of Otto reached her now and then through the town, and none of it was good. With fresh money in his pocket for the first time in his life from the sale of the farm, the old man came to believe himself rich and surrounded himself with people who let him go on believing it. He put money into a business he had no idea how to run, and it failed. He loaned money to a friend who never paid him back. He let himself be courted by a woman a good deal younger, who stuck around as long as there was something to stick around for, and vanished the moment it ran out. The man who had schemed so hard to keep everything for himself turned out not to know how to hold on to any of it, because he'd never once known where a single dollar of it truly came from. The one who'd known that was the one he'd put out of the house. Without her, the money slipped through his fingers the way whey slips out of a badly pressed curd. Frida took no pleasure in it. It would be a lie to say it made her glad, and it would be just as much a lie to say it grieved her deeply. What she felt instead was a distant kind of sadness, the kind you feel for an acquaintance sliding downhill that you neither can nor ought to help anymore. She had loved that man. She had had children with him. Watching him sink gave her no satisfaction at all, though he would have taken plenty of satisfaction watching her sink. And that was the difference between the two of them, the one that had always been there, the one that finally became plain to everybody in the end. Otto died 2 years later, old and alone, in a rented room in the city, not far from the fairgrounds he'd loved so much as a young man. The money from selling the farm went fast, into bad investments and worse advice, and into people who stuck close as long as there was something to gain, the way water runs through the fingers of a man who never once knew where it came from. Frida heard about it through the town from a neighbor woman who carried her the news one afternoon. She didn't go to the funeral, not out of bitterness, she'd clarify whenever somebody asked, but because it wasn't hers to attend anymore, because that man had stopped being hers long before any paper was ever signed. She did send a candle out to the cemetery with a young man from town, just one for the 60 years, for the girl and the boy who'd once danced together at a county fair a whole lifetime back, a stolen flower and a pair of shined-up boots, back when neither one of them knew yet what they'd become to each other. Frida lived several more good years after that, in her small white house at the edge of town, making her cheese, drinking her coffee from her own cup, selling at the market on market days. She lived quiet, lived her own, which is the only decent way to live. On Sundays, when there was a fair on in some nearby town, she'd put on her good shawl coat and go listen to music a while at the square, eat an ear of sweet corn, watch the people pass by. And sometimes, folks who saw her say, she'd dance a slow little step alone, standing there by the bandstand, eyes closed, remembering things only she knew. Her children, the 3 who'd lived, came back around once they learned what had happened, a little ashamed they hadn't been there, hadn't stood up for their mother in time. Frida took them back without a word of reproach. She wasn't one to go around collecting on old debts. Her daughter would come stay with her for stretches and help her with the cows and the cheese. And in the evenings the 2 of them would sit out on the little lot under the fig tree, drinking coffee, watching the sun drop behind the hill. In those evenings Frida was happy in a quiet, unhurried way. The happiness of someone who owes nobody anything anymore and fears nobody either. She had enough. She wasn't rich and didn't care to be. She had her house in her name, her account in her name, her 3 cows each with a name, her kitchen smelling a little more of cheese every day, her spot at the market, her freedom. She had enough left over to send her daughter a little money when things got tight, to put in the offering plate at church, to buy herself a new shawl coat now and then. She still had gold left in a drawer, some of what she'd buried, and now and then she'd take out a coin and hold it up to the light, not out of greed, but to remember every daybreak that coin stood for, everything it had cost her to be free at the end of the road. The women of the town, especially the young ones, started coming around her kitchen to have her teach them cheese-making. That was the excuse, anyway. But Frida taught them the trade, and along the way, while they cut curd together, she taught them the other thing too, the thing that truly mattered, the thing that had cost her 60 years and a whole house to learn. "Keep what's yours, girls," she'd tell them, her hands down in the warm curd, never once stopping her work. "Work hard. Love your man if he's good and treats you right. Give him his place. But always keep back something that's more your own a little bit, whatever nobody would miss, whatever nobody knows about. And learn to read what you sign, girls. Learn it, even if it's hard, even if they tell you it isn't a woman's business, even if your intended gets sore about it. A paper can erase you or a paper can save you. It all depends on who's got it kept safe the day the trouble breaks." One of those girls, a newly married young woman named Darlene, truly listened. She started setting aside a little from what she earned selling her needlework, a little at a time in her own name, in secret, not out of distrust of her husband, but not leaving everything in his hands either. Years later, when life dealt that same Darlene a hard blow of her own, not a divorce but widowhood, and in-laws looking to push her out with nothing, she had something to defend herself with, something to lean on while she got her affairs in order. She went looking for Frida to thank her, both of them old women by then. Frida only squeezed her hand with her numbed old fingers and told her, "Don't thank me, honey. Thank the woman who's going to listen to you tomorrow and pass it along. Teach somebody else. That's how the chain doesn't break. That's what it was all about in the end. Not gold, not revenge. It was about a chain of women passing the same knowledge hand to hand, mother to daughter, old woman to young one, the same way you pass down how to cut curd. Keep what's yours, read what you sign, don't let yourself be erased, and teach the one coming up behind you. That chain went back to Matilda, and to Matilda's own mother before her, and further back still, to nameless women who learned the hard way what it costs to have nothing of your own. Frida was one link in that chain, a strong link, the kind that holds when the chain gets pulled taut. Keep what's yours. That was the lesson and the legacy of Frida Bucher Zimmerman, dairywoman of the Driftless Hills, near Monroe, Wisconsin, land of springs and vineyards and county fairs, who at 85 years old, divorced and stripped bare by the man she'd lived with for 60, pulled up from under the floor of her own kitchen the gold she'd gathered coin by coin over half a century, and the proof she'd kept paper by paper in an old tin with a faded picture on the lid. And with that, not with revenge, but with patient cunning and with dignity, she won back what was hers, and her full name, and her independence, even though the price of that victory was losing forever the old house where she had once been happy. Stay with me a moment before we finish, and let's think together about what this story leaves behind, because I didn't tell it just to pass the time. I told it because Frida isn't only one woman, she's many. She's your grandmother, your mother, your aunt, the neighbor, the woman who sells you cheese at the market whose story you never once thought to ask about. In every town, in every neighborhood, there's a woman who gave her whole life to a house and a man and some children without a wage, without a paper, without her name on a single deed, and who one day stood watching them divide up, without her, what she herself had built. Most of them were never saved by any buried gold. Most of them were left with the suitcase and the apron. And that's how they went, quiet, dignified, with nobody ever telling what was done to them. Frida got lucky, if you can call patient cunning luck. She had the instinct to save while there was still time. But her story isn't worth telling for what she won in the end. It's worth telling for what it teaches the rest of us coming up behind her. That a woman's work counts even when nobody pays for it. That a paper signed blind can cost a whole lifetime. That silence sometimes isn't weakness but strategy, and that it is never, hear me now, never too late to get back what's yours and your own name along with it. She was 85 years old when she knelt down to lift that brick. 85. If she could do it at that age, with those hands, with everything stacked against her, what's stopping you? If this story stirred something in you, if it brought somebody to mind, I'm going to ask 3 things of you before you go, and they're simple. Give this video a like. It's the easiest way you have of telling this channel you want more stories like this one, about strong women that nobody else remembered to tell. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you're here for the ones still coming, because every week I pull another one of these women of ours back out of forgetting. And leave me a comment down below. Did you know a woman like this, one who was left with nothing and stood back up with what was hers, kept safe? Tell me her name and where she was from. Let it be read here, because when you write down the name of a forgotten woman, that woman doesn't fully die. Think about your own kitchen tonight, once everything's gone quiet. Think about what's been cooked there over a whole lifetime, about the taste of it, about the hands that made it. Think about what the women in your family kept back quietly, setting aside, holding on, so that you'd have something today, even if they never once told you the story. The most valuable gold in a house is almost never the kind that shines out where you can see it. It's buried, patient, quiet, right underneath, exactly where the one who thinks he owns everything would least imagine looking. Take good care of yourself. Keep what's yours and see to it that you leave with what's yours well kept.